pleasure of hosting this meeting, really to give an opportunity to all of our African climate leaders to engage on innovations that are happening across the continent, and to make sure that we are really giving a proper platform to all the actions that happen across the continent. And we elevate some of the best practices that we get to witness. We are championing the work of many that are showing true leadership within the continent around climate action. And we share some insights, and we make sure that we are not losing any momentum on the African climate capital mobilization and the work that is currently being done around the climate positive growth in the continent. And as a result, in our last meeting, we got started reflecting on what does it take to have project pipeline for climate action projects. And we reflected as well on projects that are happening and investments happening around nature assets and land restoration, and the project of AFR 100. We reflected on what Afrexim Bank is doing around climate action, and similarly talked about what we were going to do at the Africa CEO Forum around the UN Compendium of Projects. And this week, today, we are just fresh from Paris, and we were at the summit for the new Global Financial Pact. And we went there with several expectations. There were several conversations that we had. Some of them have seen some positive movement, some not so much. And today we will be reflecting on the outcomes of the Paris summit. And we will specifically break down that conversation around the Bridgetown agenda, the Sustainable Debt Coalition. We will also look at issues around financing for nature. And then we will lastly reflect on, get some updates on exactly what we should expect for the Africa Climate Action Summit. And lastly, I forgot this, get some reflections out of the Bonn conference on loss and damage. And we have fantastic speakers joining us today, or experts joining us today. And to get us started in our conversation will be the Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist with UNECA, and Dr. Morsy, Hanan Morsy, has been with UNECA for about a year, a little over a year, I believe. And she will be taking us through their expectations going into Paris and the work that they have been doing around the Sustainable Debt Coalition. Once again, thank you for joining us, and over to you, Hanan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And glad to be with you to share some reflections on what came out of the summit. I think if I were to summarize my overall take, it would be that, we ended up with some positive outcomes, but it fell short of the expectations going to the summit. So let me elaborate a little bit more, and perhaps, it in the context of the Sustainable Debt Coalition work as well, which is an initiative that came out of COP27 with and has already shown traction in terms of the number of countries. Over 25 countries expressed interest in joining that coalition, which has three main objectives. One is about addressing the very difficult fiscal position that emerging and developing countries are facing, and the impact of that fiscal position in terms of their ability to take climate action and invest in SDGs. It also has the objective of spurring action and calling for crucial commitments from partners to alleviate the debt burden while supporting the environment. And the third objective is to launch consultations on the nexus between debt, climate, and development. So in terms of how the outcome of the Paris Summit aligned with what the coalition is looking for, I think we had one of the wins was on climate contingency clauses. That there has been progress on that area. Going to the summit, we already had the UK commitment of enforcing these climate clauses in new contracts. So what came out of the summit is more the World Bank commitment to include climate contingency clauses and the US pledge to implement by the end of the year, which both are significant. However, we did not have a commitment from France on that area, which is disappointing. We need to a little bit nuance what came out in these areas, because for the World Bank, it seems that it will only apply to the most vulnerable clients, which means that it's not across the board applied, and that is something we need to look into and make sure that it's broadened in terms of application, and that it need to expand to all countries at large with certain way of setting these triggers that is automatic based on the size of the shock and the implication. And also we need to pay attention to how these clauses are phrased to make sure that they don't lead to increase in terms of debt costs for countries. So these are some of the things that will be very important to pay attention to in terms of the implementation. Another area that I think there has been progress in is issue of the debt treatment and the achievement of Zambia restructuring deal. I think definitely this is a positive step forward, but we need to keep two issues in mind. One is that the time it took for the restructuring was very long, and it's unacceptably slow. That is, we need to learn from that experience to make sure that the process for debt resolution mechanism with the GPT works better going forward. And also we need to make sure in terms of the involvement of the private sector, how we can have the process flow much smoother than what we have seen in this case. Another areas that I think, to me, I was hoping for to see more action that the summit fell short of are areas of guarantees, commitment for official guarantees and guarantees from MDBs, multilateral development banks, that can help really reducing the cost of debt and supporting, more climate action, whether it's debt for nature swaps or, green and blue bonds. That is a low cost, measure relative to other issues. And I had really hoped that we see very concrete commitment led by France on that area. Another issue that we seem to have had a bit of hopes going to the summit, but we didn't get anything concrete, is the expansion of blended finance and specific commitments in that area. At the end, there was a lot of discussion ahead of the summit that this may be one of the key achievements, but I didn't see any concrete actions on that area. I think how I see things going forward, I think that the Paris Summit was, a key milestone, that it has set the stage and that we need to accelerate the pace for the upcoming events. We have upcoming, of course, is the Nairobi Summit, Climate Summit, and this will be very important milestone, especially for Africa, and we need to really focus on, presenting concrete proposals on the loss and damage fund, including the funding mechanism before COP27. And that should be one of the key areas of focus for Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. And also we should work on stimulating the partnership on debt treatment and additional climate financing, with the more engagement from G7 countries than what we have seen in the Paris summit. After the Nairobi summit, we will have also the coalition official launch in Cairo, which will be held September 14 to 15. And all countries and development partners are invited to participate to advance that agenda further. So I think we have achieved some kind of concrete progress on some areas, but it's not enough. It needs to be done, and we need to push the agenda forward. Over to you.
Thanks, Hanan. So a quick question from me is, there's been such a strong focus on MDBs and around the MDB reform. Is there space for non-state actors here in this discussion around sustainable debt? How do we then also ask our other African partners to get involved in advancing the issues for Sustainable Debt Coalition?
I think definitely it's an issue for all stakeholders, because what is at stake is huge. We're talking about African countries having to divert resources from social spending, health, education, climate action to actually meet debt service. And to change that paradigm, we need all actors, including, of course, MDBs, have a very important role to play. And personally, I was hoping also that we get concrete commitment for that, the rechanneling of IMF special drawing rights to multinational development banks to get these 5 countries that we needed for the proposal by the African Development Bank. It didn't happen. So we need to push forward to make sure that this actually materializes. But we need the state, all the non-state actors for advocacy to make sure that the issues keep being hammered. There has been before the summit a lot of action in the New York state legislation. That was, I think, state actors at their best in terms of really mobilizing the momentum. And we hope that this goes through and that the agenda is also pushed in terms of the climate clauses and the force majeure clauses to be actually required in the US. That requires all the state, non-state actors, but also we have to acknowledge that some of the non-state actors, especially philanthropy, have been leading the way forward even before the official. Meaning, for example, in terms of the nature, the debt for nature swaps, it was enabled by philanthropies who actually went to do this. What we need is they need to make sure that they're raising the flag and the voice, that they have shown demonstration effect. They have shown that these can actually be successfully done. And we need to move from the millions to the billions and trillions. This cannot be done through philanthropy. We need the other actors, we need the official and the MDBs.
Thank you very much. A question coming in from the chat, Hanan asks, how does the SDC relate to the V20 Debt and Climate Emergency Coalition? Sure.
Actually, it was one of the discussions we were having in Paris. So there are a lot of synergies between the two that we are now we're working together on seeing how we can actually build on these synergies to expand more. The V20 has been initially focused on really the most vulnerable countries rather than on the broader call of the need for action in this nexus of debt, environment, and SDG development. So it started with a subgroup. It kind of had a lot of the many of the most vulnerable, especially islands, but it also have some. It's led by Minister Ken of Ghana, and we are trying to see how we can actually build synergies between the V20 and the Sustainable Debt Coalition to get concrete action. And also one of the key things that can emerge with these two coming together is to find ways for debtor representations at the table. This is a key issue that's missing at the moment.
Thank you so much, Hanan. Chris has dropped another note here saying the OECD and the 30 OECD DAC members just changed the rules on issuance of guarantees. So we can engage on that comment in the chats. And now I'd like to quickly, swiftly move forward to Avi and have a discussion with Avinash Persood, the special envoy to the Prime Minister of Barbados. Now, many would know Avi to be leading the Bridgetown agenda, while others are still asking what exactly is the Bridgetown agenda. But as we were at the Paris summit, the Bridgetown agenda was quite central to the discussion. So we're very keen to understand first, really quickly, Avi, on what exactly is the Bridgetown agenda and why was it so central to the Paris summit, and how is it that the African issues, particularly around climate positive growth, relate to the Bridgetown agenda, and how could we see this coming up at the African Climate Action Summit? Over to you and welcome. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you fine, thanks.
Great, so it's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for the invitation. Let me address those key issues together, Paris, Bridgetown, and what we got and where we're going, and do that as quickly as possible, because we have a great agenda. It's great to see you and great to see the others in Paris. So I think that, when thinking about an event, it's important to consider two different perspectives. One is where we want to be, and on that basis, we will always be disappointed. We've been disappointed for over 70 years. That's unlikely to happen. That disappointment's unlikely to go away. And it's important that we continue to strongly campaign for where we want to end up, where we want to be. A much more equitable world with much greater access to finance, one closing the SDG development and climate gaps. But we should also look at where we were. And I think just 9 months ago, the things that happened last week could not have been expected or imagined. If I told you that there'd be 100 billion of special drawing rights that were pledged to be rechanneled and 60 billion had been done in 9 months, you would have said, what are you smoking? If I told you that the World Bank would announce natural disaster clauses in its lending instruments, alongside the UK Export Credit Agency, the US commitment, again, you would have said the same thing. If I told you that they would have come up with a $200 billion over 10 years, $200 billion target for increased lending by the World Bank and the MDBs based on existing capital, so using things like special drawing rights and callable capital, $200 billion. They were self-congratulating themselves in spring when they came up with 50 billion, so 200 billion. Again, you'd have said that was not something anyone expected 9 months ago. So we are a long way from where we want to be, but we have made strides that we have not made ever before, really. I think that one of the other important strides we made, which is less visible, and it's wrapped up with the Bridgetown Initiative, it's really getting the world to fully appreciate the scale of what we're trying to achieve, especially in the area of climate finance. It is a lack of scale and pace that has been a significant problem. There are countless clever, elegant ideas and proposals that don't move the needle, that don't address the scale of what we're trying to do. So thanks to the climate champions, there was a report chaired by Vera Songway and Nick Stern, which set out the numbers, and it shows that the developing world needs $2.4 trillion per year, $2.4 trillion a year. Now, all of the aid is $200 billion. So the notion that we just need to increase aid and rechannel it and refocus it, no way. I mean, and remember, this aid is coming from governments, and governments are by and large elected, and they're elected by people who are not voting for a doubling of aid. We need a 12-time increase, a 12-fold increase. They're not voting for doubling of aid, they're not voting for 10% increase in aid. As you've heard me say before, they're voting to deport foreigners, not to fund them. So that's the world we are in. The notion of voluntary carbon credit market, that's a $2.4 billion market, 1,000th of what we need. The notion of green bonds, blue bonds, debt swaps, those are good things. We need more of them, but their scale and potential for releasing anywhere near 2.4 trillion, because we already have them. Barbados, for example, has issued one of the most fetid debt swaps. We have blue bonds out there. They're good, we need more of them, but they're not going to move the needle. We need a lot more than that. And so Bridgetown says we need 5 sort of elements. And let me discuss those 5 elements in 2-3 minutes, and then talk about how Paris addressed those 5 and where it didn't. So the first element is that many developing countries, when a shock happens, they quickly end up in debt because we don't have other things to rely on. We don't have spare bits of contingent facilities. We don't have quantitative easing that we can do. And so we need to make the system, the financial system, more shock absorbing. And that requires 2 key things. One is these natural disaster clauses. Now they are 0 cost. Barbados is the world's largest issuer of them today in sovereign bonds. There's 0 cost. When a disaster hits, 2 years of suspension, interest and principal added back on at the same rate of interest later on. So you got a lot of movement on that. A tremendous amount of movement. World Bank, UK, other countries. You're not going to get European governments agreeing to it because European governments are trying to issue common bonds so that we move to what's called common issuance in the bond markets. And so one European country can't announce them unless they've all announced them. So that was a big movement. The other key aspect of liquidity in a crisis, and Africa has been using its special drawing rights, is rechanneling special drawing rights. And $100 billion was the target. $100 billion has been pledged. $60 billion have arrived. That's told us that we need to now be more ambitious. We should be pushing for an even further increase in these SDR rechannelings. The idea that the African Development Bank could pioneer and lead development banks using them, I think that's a really good one. Second key thing, we need to take a lot of developing countries have got debt that they are for things that they should not be funding. A lot of African developing countries who are suffering climate loss and damage have climate loss and damage on their balance sheets. 50% of the increase of debt of vulnerable countries is a result of loss and damage. We need the loss and damage fund. I see Richard is on the panel. He's doing some fantastic work with the transition committee. We need this loss and damage fund not only existing, it needs to be funded. And so there was much movement around the idea of a shipping tax, shipping emissions tax. Now, some of the small states are a long way away from the center. The worry is that a tax on remoteness, so there's going to be implementation ideas around a cap on that tax so that no one consumer is paying more than 1% on their bills. But a shipping's emissions tax could raise $70 or $80 billion. If a proportion of that went to loss and damage, we'd be going a lot to the loss and damage fund, we'd be going a long way. It has to be a proportion. We're not going to get the shipping industry to agree to a tax of the money that goes out of the industry. So a significant amount of that money must go to decarbonizing the shipping industry, but also a third maybe to the loss and damage fund. There was discussions around a financial transactions tax. President Macron came out, a number of other people came out supporting it, which is a rare thing, but that has a long way to go before it gets more momentum. It's a tax I personally am a big champion of, but it's not a popular tax you could imagine in the financial sector. The other thing we need to do is we need to take mitigation, climate mitigation. Developing countries African developing countries in particular are doing something like 86% of all climate mitigation is their work, because the private sector isn't there. And the private sector is not there, the cost of capital, risks are too high. So there was much discussion in Paris of the Bridgetown idea of a FX guarantee for investors investing in green transformation projects. You talked about getting the non-state actors involved. We think that's a key catalyst for getting non-state actors involved in the green transformation. And there's much discussion of setting up a pilot before COP this year. And that's a very important progress. And the final thing is, look, we're not going to be able to take all of this debt off our balance sheet. So loss and damage fund will take some money away from us. Mitigation, green transformation, the private sector may take some money away if we have the guarantees. There's going to be debt. We're going to have to build better seawalls, better resilience. But we need that debt to be, if it's not concessional for either countries, and the IDA amount needs to be rapidly replenished. There was discussion of that, but no numbers. We need new instruments, new low-cost, long-term debt instruments. And the World Bank established a committee to look into that, and that's something we need to keep pushing. Finally, debt restructuring. So many developing countries, especially after COVID, have a lot of debt. Debt is unsustainable. We can't simply cancel all debt if you want to borrow again. So the real debt problem in the world is actually a private sector debt problem. And that's where debt cancellation is not a solution if you want to borrow again. So we need debt restructuring. We need it easier to have debt restructuring. We saw a speeded up common framework. Ghana and Zambia came out of Paris with new debt deals, which have been stuck for far too long, as was said earlier. These debt deals, the question for me is, can we institutionalize what happened? We've got China along the table with the others, great, but is that going to be a new framework? Or was that one-off deals? We have to have a summit every time we do it. Hopefully, it's ideas towards a new program. But those were two very important deals that were achieved and a model, therefore, of future deals. But that's debt restructuring for the public sector. For the private sector debt restructuring, you need the IMF. You need IMF programs. And so we need the IMF to be much more supportive of homegrown plans that are politically, economically, socially sustainable. And we've got some further work to achieve that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Avi. I think you've actually made it quite well. The one last question is, so what's next for the Bridgetown agenda? We know you released the Bridgetown 2.0 that's been under discussion. What's next for the Bridgetown agenda going at ACS? And what are some of the more, maybe picking 3 key issues that we should be focusing on the implementation and advancing around lobbying at ACS?
Well, I think that we need to keep to the idea of an adult framework with real numbers. Again, I think we need to move away from fanciful financial innovation. I'm a finance guy. I love it that people think financial innovation can solve problems because it makes me seem important. But the reality is you need real resources. There's no fancy tool that's going to solve this problem. And the idea of insurance and renaming bonds and debt swaps, I think we need real resources. So a big ask in Bridgetown is a new capital, not just sweating the existing capital, and we got that in Paris. We now need to move towards new capital commitments. Maybe that's conditional, maybe it's phased, but that's a big focus of the Bridgetown campaign. The second thing is helping Richard arrive at COP with some real commitments on numbers on the loss and damage fund, whether that's a shipping tax or maybe progress on an oil and gas pollution fund. Sultan Al Jaber of the UAE is looking at, I think, is interested in perhaps bringing the industry together to come and talk about the long run future, which must include proper contributions to things like loss and damage and decarbonization and a sustainable future. So those are, loss and damage, new capital, extending this wave of SDR rechanneling and clauses, but there's good progress already being made on that.
Great. You know, I know you and I have had this discussion around insurance, and I'm going to tap on you for a little bit. Our next discussion, in our next session, we will be discussing some of the innovations around the insurance industry in response to climate action. But can you, for everybody else that hasn't had this conversation with you, expand on why you think insurance in itself is not necessarily a viable solution for the crisis and the vulnerabilities that we are expecting?
There is absolutely zero possibility that insurance is a solution. Climate change is an uninsurable event. Imagine you are trying to get car insurance, and the person giving you car insurance knows that you're going to have 1 accident this year, and 2 accidents next year, and 3 accidents the year after, and 4 accidents the year after that, and 5 accidents the year after that. What insurance premium do you think they're going to charge you? So insurance only works when the risk of the event is a sort of a random event that is spread out over a long period of time, not rising every year. And it only works when it is unrelated to other problems. But now those of us experiencing climate change are experiencing floods in the same year we're experiencing droughts. In the same year we're getting sargassum seaweed because of the warming oceans. In the same year that we're getting salt water in the water systems. So the correlations are rising, the risks are rising. There's no way. So the global shield idea is this idea that they will put up, the donors will put up some money to pay some premiums, and the insurance companies will add capital. Well, the donors have put up about $270 million. Remember, we need $100 billion. They put up $270 million. We need $100 billion for loss and damage. And you're seeing none of the donors have anywhere a budget line in their budget saying they're going to be paying insurance premiums for developing countries suffering from climate change. So I think it is a fantastical idea. I think it's disingenuous. And I think that it's a dangerous idea because it's a distraction from what we need, which is real resources for countries who have been suffering from loss and damage and have the kind of problems. Do you imagine that any insurance company would have insured anywhere near the amount that Pakistan needed after the horrors of last year? $40 billion. Insurance is not the solution, and it's a dangerous distraction.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to capture this video and play it in our next session so that the insurance industry can respond adequately to your comments. You know, we've had this discussion a lot, and I do like challenging you on it once in a while. But thank you so much, Avi, for joining us and for sharing those thoughts. Anybody with comments and questions for Avi, please do drop them in the chat, and we can revisit them at towards the end. And next, we will bring on Dr. Mutari Aminu-Kana, who is the Director of Policy and Government Relations at TNC. Now, TNC has been at the center of the discussions of non-state actors' participation in financing and leading innovation as a response to climate change and thinking about climate debt swaps. We've seen them being quite critical to the space and financing for nature. Now, when we left Gabon at the One Forest Summit, there was an expectation that the Paris Summit, now focusing on this new green financing pact, will bring in issues of financing for nature. What were your thoughts and what are your reflections on the Paris Summit as a result, in particular to financing for nature? And what are some of the things that you're doing that you think we need to be working on and scaling across the continent, and what you want to see being profiled at ACS? Dr. Mutari, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bogolo. Can you hear me?
I can
Hello?
hear you, yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so again, thanks for inviting me. And to answer your question straight, as usual with these large meetings, especially on broader development, I left with a sense that the biodiversity crisis and nature is sort of a poor cousin in all the discussions during the 2 days. It did come up quite a lot. It came up in the context of nature-based solutions. It came up in the context of natural climate solutions as well, but it was sort of a bit in the background. But luckily, a lot of the issues being discussed and some of the solutions that were coming around, whether it's for development or for climate or other issues, is actually, they would work for nature as well. So it's like the previous speaker said, really, there were some groundbreaking things, a lot of things that you wouldn't imagine would happen 10 or 5 years ago, and you are hearing about them now. With respect to the Convention on Biological Diversity, there have been lots of discussions around Tobin tax, around aviation tax as possible funding instruments, and 5 years ago, this would have been almost like a pie in the sky. It's such a long range no that you wouldn't even imagine people would be talking about a global shipping tax or global Tobin tax as a distinct possibility in this discussion. So I think that was good. And to follow Avi about figures, I think the nature community have really been ahead in terms of putting figures to some of the financing needs for addressing the biodiversity crisis. In 2020, we ourselves, TNC, were involved in a study that looked at globally how much spend was going into nature, how much is needed, and what is the funding gap. And to reverse the decline in biodiversity by 2030, that study came up with a figure of a spending need of about 722 to 967 billion. So we had the funding gap. It fed into the discussions at the CBD COP15 in Montreal last year. And I think there were several things that came out positive from there as well. But this whole issue about the multilateral development systems and the need to change was really a big thing in that as well. So in that report I was referring to, there was also a proposal on some of the key mechanisms that are needed to close really this funding gap for addressing nature. 3 key issues. One is to reduce harmful investments, because harmful subsidies that are harming biodiversity are really a key part of the funding needs for addressing the nature crisis. Almost half, if you stop those harmful subsidies and redirect the subsidies, then you really address almost half of the funding need. The next thing is producing new revenue, and then finally investing wisely. There is also a recent study that was done, and TNC is involved, on the funding need and the gap for natural climate solutions. And some of the key findings of that study is that the countries in the greatest need of NCS funding tend to have the high NCS potential. And again, I go back to the study that Avi referred to, which the Climate Champion was involved in, which was released in Paris, about the need for development. And those figures, I think, are really telling as well. $2.4 trillion needed for addressing the climate and nature-related spending requirements. Out of that, I think for the nature-related funding, it was about 350 billion needed in emerging markets and developing countries. And I think what I like about that study is that it also proposed or forecasted where those funding could come from. And it shows that domestic spending on climate and nature related thing needs to increase by 3.5 times if we are to meet those requirements, but external spending needs to increase by 5 times. And the component of the external spending that needs to increase most are the private funding and the bilateral and innovative concessional funding. So this is somewhere where we have a lot of examples of things happening, including from non-state actors or civil society, as you mentioned, and our organization, the TNC, is involved in helping to mobilize both domestic resources for nature, but also external resources. So some of the models we have used include water funds, where we are promoting green infrastructure at source waters in order to ensure the availability of water for downstream communities. And water users in cities and in industries like bottling companies are actually providing the funding for that. And we have several examples in Africa of water funds model going, with the Nairobi one being the most advanced, where it is now an independent entity that is sustainable and that is being funded by philanthropy, by businesses and so on. So a sort of catalyzing and mobilizing domestic resources on that. Blue bonds, we've talked a lot about that. That's also something that TNC has been involved with in debt refinancing. And in Africa, especially the example of Seychelles, where currently, as a result of that debt restructuring, $430,000 a year is being available for ocean conservation. Another model is the Project Finance for Permanence, which we call the PFP, which in our partnership with WWF, the Pew Charitable Trust, and Zoma Lab, we are rolling out in a number of countries. And this is using a suite of instruments, really funding instruments that are helping to establish sustainable financing mechanisms that will help countries to meet their commitments to the 30 by 30 target under the new global biodiversity framework. There is also the MBSAP Accelerator Partnership, which is a partnership that was set up and launched in Montreal at the CBD COP, which is to support countries to revise and update their national biodiversity strategy and action plan. There are several other things out there, but the key thing is to raise the right financing for nature. We really need to provide the enabling environment for nature-based businesses. And in Africa, I think there are several challenges to that, but there are also many organizations that are helping to achieve that. So if I link it, all of this up to the Bonn meetings and the Paris meeting, I think in particular in Paris, like I said, I haven't had as much as I would like to about financing nature, but I think a lot of the innovative things coming up, and they talk about MDB reforms and the financial transaction tax, the shipping tax and other things, which are a bucket that will serve not just health, education, climate, other development issue, but would also work for nature.
Yeah, before you conclude, can I just tag on that point? And if you can just expand a little bit on what do country plans look like that are attached to nature assets? I know this is something that has been discussed in Gabon and partly in Paris, and there was a coalition to protect and fund natural capital that was set up in Paris. And if you can just expand on that a little bit as well. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So there is a group of development partners, including non-state actors that have got together under an initiative called the Country Packages for Forests, Nature and Climate. And what brought them together was really seeing that after COP27, or even since from Glasgow to COP27 and then to Montreal, that there is really a momentum in terms of political will to address the climate and nature crisis more seriously. And that political will has also generated really quite a bit of funding. But there was a challenge, and that challenge is that of coordination. Several of the actors are doing things not in coordination, in isolation, and so they thought it would be good to have an initiative where there would be a coordination of the various actors in particular countries, especially high forested countries in the Congo Basin, in places like Indonesia, in Asia, or in the Amazon. And that's the aim of that particular thing. It's more a coordination initiative to get actors, donors together in order to pool their strength and concentrate it in particular geographies where there is a high likelihood of showing impact when that kind of coordinated action takes place.
Thank you so much, Mutare, for that explanation. I haven't seen any follow-up questions on nature financing in the comments, but my main thing was around those country packages, and we're very interested in following up in this particular issue because some are seeing them as an alternative to JETPs, but ones that can empower nature economies. So as we go to ACS, we are very keen to host a session that can unpack what exactly these mean and exactly how much finance can be unlocked through these packages. Because what we really do want is sustainability even of financing for nature. Thank you for joining us, and we will now go to our one but last speaker, and bringing us to the discussions in Bonn around loss and damage, which I know everybody has been following since COP27. We have Mr. Richard Sherman, who's the co-chair of the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage. Richard, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Great.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Bogolo and
thank
colleagues.
You for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Let me start off with Bonn, reflections on Bonn. So I think we need to be honest with ourselves that 7 years away from having to meet a 43% emissions reduction target by 2030, we're seriously not even on the track, right? We haven't even found the vehicle to get on track. And that's so we have a potentially massive crisis looming 7 years away from 2030. We saw the SDG report, both from the UNSG as well as from Jeffrey Sachs's outfit last week, saying that not many countries or hardly any countries are on target to meet the SDG targets by 2030. And Avinash is correct. If we don't start talking about the scale of numbers now, not in 2050, we're not going to resolve this issue. So negotiating, having an agenda fight on whether or not we're discussing how to finance mitigation in developing countries as part of the mitigation process, whether it's under one holistic agenda or it's in two separate places, is a rather big shock for those of us who are still on the highs of Sharm el-Sheikh. So Bonn was a huge, I think, setback right now, but I think also we can term it as almost a positive challenge to the incoming COP presidency to see how their leadership is going to be tested over the next 6 months and how they're going to play out with these issues in the UAE. So that's really on Bonn. On Paris, I mean, I think we were expecting a lot more support for the loss and damage fund. There's a very vague reference of it in the final outcome document linked to the Global Shield. And on this one, I totally agree with Avinash that the Global Shield is a distraction right now. And the focus for us really needs to be on the fund because the only way to interpret the Sharm el-Sheikh decision is the recognition by all parties that we need a new multilateral fund for loss and damage, but that fund will have to operate at scale and at size, and that we need to develop this fund so it's operational in 2024. And so that's really the task that we've been tasked with as a transitional committee. I would have hoped that Avinash and colleagues in Paris would have resolved the sources issue, but clearly there's more work to be done, so we're going to have to work on that. For us, the next steps are, we've now, in my assessment, concluded our discussions on loss and damage. We have to get down to drafting this document, this terms of reference, this governing framework on loss and damage for the fund and for all the other funding arrangements. The fund will be in the center of the loss and damage universe, and it will have to coordinate all these players and to lead them. Therefore, we're looking forward to our next set of discussions, but within the African continent, we have the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, which is as negotiated, our next level of hierarchy in the political system. And so we're looking forward to very, very strong messages from our ministers on the fund. And that message will go from the ministers to the African Climate Summit to the heads of state. What we need is really this very core, issue that Avinash spoke to, which is not necessarily our task as the transitional committee, but it's the capitalization of the fund. We need to have people, we need President Ruto to insist in his invitation letter that you're coming to Nairobi to make a pledge. Right? So this has to be conditional on participation in the African Climate Summit. But we don't want leaders to come and say, we're going to think about a shipping tax or an aviation tax. Those things will happen elsewhere. We want them to come to Nairobi and say, we're going to capitalize this fund so that it's operational in 2024, and it will start with $30 billion in its first year, because loss and damage is happening now. It's not happening in the future, right? So part of the other work that we're doing is about ensuring mitigation over time, but the problem is we're dealing with loss and damage now, and therefore we need a fund and funding arrangements that work for developing countries right now, which is also why, again, I think the World Bank announcements are useful around the debt clauses, but it's not, we need more and we need more now. And the African Climate Summit, and if we take the leadership that has been displayed very adequately in Paris by not only President Ruto, but all the African presidents who demanded action on all fronts, we need to build and capitalize on that, and we have to use the summit as well as the ministerial meeting on loss and damage in New York, as well as the General Assembly process, to make sure that we have money in the fund pledged, irrespective of what the outcome of our governance work is. Our work is very mechanical, it's very legal. What we need to have is the money in the fund, and that should be the priority going forward. The board itself, once we set up a fund, will be the body that will do a lot of the technical work on whether it's insurance, how you fund the insurance, what is the kind of immediate payouts, what are the triggers, what are the windows. So we won't conclude all that. So we don't need to, we just need to legally set up a fund with instruments to be able to do the work, right? And I think certainly Avinash we're getting a document from me next week on Monday, which will be the first draft decision text from developing countries to look at around what we want the fund to peruse. And so hopefully well, not hopefully, we will deliver this fund. What we need to do is for others to help us raise the money. And I think I think the only other final thing that we have to focus on is that there will have to be a decision at COP28 around the transitional arrangements. So how do we make sure that the fund is operational on the 1st of January 2024, and that will require just some mechanical understandings of where the fund will be hosted and what kinds of institutional arrangements. I don't expect that to be overtly political, except for one or two issues around the legal nature of the fund, but those are mechanical issues. So it would be really useful if the climate champions and the colleagues working with the climate champions team in Africa can help us focus in on this need for contributions to the fund, so that we will be able to respond to loss and damage in early 2024. I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. I mean, it's very clear, but for participation, and that President Ruto should be clear if you want to show up at the summit, contribute to this fund. We've had many questions from non-state actors asking exactly how it is that they're supposed to show up for the loss and damage fund, or just the conversation around loss and damage broadly. So how should people get involved in this particular space?
So I think one of the issues that's really important is to understand, and it's not something that we have to resolve now immediately, but how does the fund, and the fund that we hope will operate at scale, put money directly into the hands of communities, or communities that are impacted by loss and damage events, and that's not such an easy task. So we are going to have to find, at this moment, a hook to mandate the governing bodies and the funding arrangements to make sure that it's not just a channel directly to government. That might be a primary task, is to put money into direct budget support to national treasuries and governments can distribute it, but it also needs to have a channel to allow communities to access the fund. So I think this is going to, if we fail to do that now and in the future, then we failed those communities, because we can't always, government will always be the main player, but we've seen in some countries, in some circumstances, people are vulnerable, people are still left or marginalized for whatever reasons, and we can't afford to allow that marginalization to continue to happen because of climate injustice. So I think there's a massive role. The private sector role is a little bit more complicated. We would hope that they are also contributing to the work of the fund by providing resources. But my sense is that they're going to be key players in the rebuilding and rehabilitation process. So I think we need to make sure that, if you look at the Mozambique disaster earlier this year, it had UNICEF issuing a call to rebuild 3,000 schools. We need somebody to make sure that the rebuilding, the critical roles for civil society, the private sector, everybody should play. I think right now the focus is really on this fund and what it looks like and how it works. And we've put in place, we've discussed as developing countries, the importance of having language in the decision around stakeholder participation, whether that's the country level, whether that's the fund level, but civil society and the private sector and business people will be core implementers of this loss and damage fund. We're just the designers right now. So I think there's further work to be done next year on this matter.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. So everybody to stay informed in the issues of loss and damage, push some lobbying where they can to make sure that the transitional arrangements are being done, and then prepare for the implementation side, because that is where really non-state actors will need to mobilize and to be quite active. I think that is quite clear. If anybody has questions around LMD, once again, please throw them in the chat. We will have a little bit of time towards the end for more, to open up for those questions. And for our last speaker, we are getting an update on the Africa Climate Action Summit, and these will be given to us by Flavia Howard, who's the co-founder of the Nairobi Climate Network, and she's a senior manager with CAPA, who are our partners in delivering these sharing actions meeting. And Flavia is quite integral, or sits integrally in the team. that is currently planning the Africa Climate Action Summit. Flavia, what do we need to know at this stage? The last meeting we asked, how do we get involved? We were given several emails. What is the update with the thematic areas for the summit? And what should we expect as we prepare ourselves for the summit? Thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Bogolo. Good to see you again. Hi, everyone. Yes, I will provide a bit of an update on the summit and where we are, and I think answer your questions in the process. I'm guessing that most of you do have a broad understanding or background as to what the summit is. But just to sort of a quick reiterate, so the summit is hosted by the government of Kenya and the AU. So CAPE has come in to support the Office of the Climate Envoy, who is of course part of the government of Kenya team that is organizing the summit. The idea of the summit, as we know, is to really focus on the opportunities for climate action, to think about how the summit can change the narrative for Africa on climate change, and to really bring some of those big opportunities and deals to the forefront. It is happening the same week as Africa Climate Week, and in the same city, although different location. So we are also just being very conscious about how we have a parallel, but also kind of strengthening the agenda of each summit in parallel. So to update from the last call that you'd have had, I think the first big update is that the summit itself has a new CEO, Joseph Nganga, who is from GIAP, and he will be leading the summit team and the preparations for that for the summit over the coming couple of months. The other update is that we've had a real consolidation and collaboration across multiple partners and organizations who have been supporting various government departments in pulling the summit together. So over the past few weeks, we've really kind of pulled all of that together and had a real convergence of the structure and of the agenda for that summit. So I will just share with you now my screen. I think it's useful to just run through what that is currently looking like. So if you can now see my screen, the themes and the summits, the themes and the topics for the summit have shifted just a little bit probably since the last call. So we're now looking at 7 overarching pillars, but they still fall within the framing that you may have heard before, which is around greening what we consume. And within green what we consume, we're talking about the energy transition and renewable energy, green minerals and manufacturing, sustainable agriculture, land and ocean use, and sustainable infrastructure and urbanization. We've still got a really strong emphasis on protecting what we have, now that natural capital pillar, which covers multiple topics within it. You'll see there, say, lots of subtopics that fall within these pillars, and the ones that you note with a little star are the ones that speak to carbon removals. So that's no longer a standalone pillar, but it is still very much reflected in this agenda. We know that carbon removal is a huge kind of opportunity and emphasis for many actors, and want to make sure that it is still coming through strongly. We're then looking at the impact of inaction, so adaptation and resilience are still in there, and very much a kind of a cross-cutting theme, although I think we may find that also comes out perhaps even more strongly in Africa Climate Week, whereas it's the opportunities to take action, which is what the focus is on the summit. And then the levers and enablers, obviously climate finance, unlocking investment flows, and within that carbon markets, and a lot of the things we've been talking about earlier, around the debt for nature swaps and financial institutions coming through there. The other thing I would just highlight is lots of different parties involved. So CAPE is just one of many. We are supporting the coordination of 3 of those 7 pillars. But within this whole kind of collaboration, we also have country partners, so specific countries across the continent that will take the lead on specific topic areas. We have a high-level think tank that is very involved in providing the guidance and the oversight for this content, as well as technical input from Kenyan ministries and other international organizations. So it very much is a collaborative effort, and that's what's kind of all coming together at the moment. One last thing, I'll just skip ahead to actually what the sessions are going to look like, because I think that's the meat that people are really interested in at the moment, and what we are very much producing at the moment. So within each of these sessions, we will have a topical plenary session that is very much anchored by a high-level speaker, the presidents, the ministers, and indeed high-level CEOs who can really speak to what is that opportunity, making sure that all of these sessions are really focused on the opportunities, the benefits for the continent, and also what is the specific narrative for the continent. Within that, we've also sourced a pipeline of more than 200 different projects, announcements, initiatives that have something new to say. And we want to make sure that everyone who is getting on a stage, both within the plenary, but also in the sessions that happen outside the plenary, they've got something that something new to say, something new to bring to the table, and they also have a specific ask to come away from those sessions. So we are avoiding having, well, we are remaining focused on all these sessions being really, really action orientated. And that could look either so we've got 3 different types of sessions. So implementation convenings, these are your pledges that are coming forwards and they've made a commitment to action. And the focus of the session then will be on saying, okay, well, how do we take this pledge into action? How do we turn it into implementation? So having that focus. The second one is a deal room. So where we've got organizations that are looking for funding, they are looking for partners, they are looking for investment. We say, okay, let's get you in a deal room, let's make that deal happen. And then finally, the showcase, where we've got people with proven points, success stories, and partnerships that are working. They can share those achievements and also share the learnings and help to scale their solutions elsewhere. So again, remaining super focused on this being the action summit for the week. I'll pause there and stop sharing my screen because I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions and happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Flavia. Great to see the progression in the planning of ACS. And I know that you've started sending out invitations to experts to get involved in delivering content associated with the ACS. Now, I haven't received any questions in the chat at the moment on ACS, but if there's anybody that is curious about how they get involved, last week we shared, the last meeting we shared some emails, and if you can, please, Flavia, put those emails once again for people to reach out to you and ask and to get involved in the summit. There is more generally a question. Thank you, Flavia, again for joining us. There's more generally a question that has come up on how exactly, or any suggestions of how to assist developing countries like Botswana in developing the policies or incentives that encourage nature-based solutions in the built environment and construction industry. Funny enough, I think the right person to respond to this question is Flavia, even though she didn't come here specifically to deal with these issues. Flavia, would you like to just respond to that question?
Well, the first thing I would just say is I can share with you the contact details for getting involved with the summit. It's probably no longer us, but I'm absolutely happy to share with you that contact so that you can get involved. I'm afraid I've totally forgotten what your second question was. Please can you remind me?
The second question was, what are the suggestions on any suggestions of how to assist developing countries in developing policies or incentives that encourage nature-based solutions in the built environment and construction industry?
Well, I think through the summit, there's definitely going to be opportunities to engage on those subjects. I wouldn't say that we've necessarily come to clear lines of how to do that, clear pathways and roadmaps, but I'm very happy to kind of connect people into the right, the right places to have those conversations at the summit.
Thanks, Flavia. Jamie.
Thanks, Bogolo. Thanks, Flavia. Just 2 observations, which is that for those of us who are big fans and very excited about the Africa Climate Action Summit. President Ruto's remarks in Paris about a need for a new green bank, obviously, have got significant coverage in the Financial Times and have got some attention, and obviously has strategic implications for the summit and its positioning. So I just quite like partners' views on that. And secondly, the point we've alluded to a few times in the call, but which I think we need a really, really good media strategy in advance of the summit, is to nail the narrative around the climate positivity and loss and damage in a way that is totally consistent. Because again, going into Paris, there were different parts of the government saying potentially different things, and it's extremely important that be a really conjoined and unified narrative from all the different sorts of key stakeholders, and above all, of course, the host country. So making sure that we kind of really nail is really, really important. So
yeah, absolutely.
But that, I would say, is sort of needs to rise up the agenda.
Yeah, so on your first point about the Green Bank, there is going to be a list, as well as these sort of 200 plus projects, announcements, initiatives that we have sourced. They really vary across themes, across topics, across scale. But in addition to those, we're probably going to have a short list of, let's say, around 10 very, very high profile projects and initiatives that are going to sort of take the front pages. That is being very much managed by the government and the broader partners. So I couldn't speak to whether or not the Green Bank is currently on there. But I think that's what we will find, is that as well as this kind of broad base of action, we're going to have those kind of flagship headlines that are coming in there. And on the loss and damage piece, I think you're absolutely right in that there's two narratives, and there's more the kind of two different sets of thinking, and actually it shouldn't be two. There should be a unified narrative. I'd love to actually hand over to Caroline on that one, because I know that's something you've been giving a lot of thought to, and how that shows up.
Caroline?
Sorry, you broke up in the tail bit for me, Flavia, on the alignment of the messaging within the government, or the balance of loss and damage and opportunity.
I think the latter, so not just in relation to government, but in relation to the broader narrative in the summit, and how those two sit side by side.
Yeah, so the thinking so far, and as you said, Flavia, a lot has happened in the past couple of weeks, which brought a lot of streams together under a new CEO's office and PMO, which also means that we don't have full line of sight of all of those streams and all those influences. So where that exactly goes from here, I have no crystal ball on how that lands, but the thinking so far has been to do it in two ways. Basically, on one hand, as you were saying, Flavia, make sure that the summit and ACW are complementary, jointly comprehensive, giving the opportunity for the summit to focus more on the opportunities, the economic growth opportunities that exist in climate action, so that the topics that are more related purely to loss and damage and adaptation probably have a slightly more natural home in ACW. And that way, collectively, they cover the entire space, and there's room for the sort of brutto message, if you will, of opportunity and growth to take center stage at the summit. The second way in which that will show up is that the topics that, and we've continuously framed that, the risk of inaction or the cost of inaction, and that's going to be center at the stage setting of the Climate Action Summit, of framing that this is not just an opportunity, but actually, if you don't grab the opportunity, there's a big set of issues that you will face, right? So it's not you can do this. If you don't do it, you're just missing out on something. So that's also where loss and damage and risk and conflict and migration, etc., will have its natural home in the summit. So that's the thinking so far, both sort of in that framing of the summit and then more in depth in ACW. But I'll be honest that the recent bringing together of a lot of streams in the summit means that there's a bit of dust in the air that still needs to settle on exactly how that pans out.
Yes, so we hope that in our next catch up, the dust would have settled a little bit more, and we'll have a bit more direction on what to expect, what are the possible outcomes. I know there's been a talk of a declaration, there's been a talk of crowding in finance into particular pots and so forth. So would like that clarity in August. That brings me to wrapping up this meeting, because I haven't seen any hands, and I want to give you back 15 minutes of your time. We asked for an hour and 30 minutes of your time, and now we are all very close to that. I want to thank very much our speakers for joining us today and for sharing their actions across the continent and the globe, and giving us their reflections on Paris. I want to also thank our UN high-level climate champions, Dr. Mahmoud Mohildeen and Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak for their support, and Mr. Nigel Topping, who's he'll always be our high-level champion for COP26, and Jamie for inspiring this Sharing Actions Africa platform. And really want to also thank my team for their continued efforts and for their tireless efforts in putting this together, and our partners for their support. Now, our next meeting will be focusing on issues around adaptation. So we'll be looking at the African Cities and Water Fund. We'll be looking at the Africa Green Hydrogen work, and we will be looking at the insurance piece under the Nairobi Declaration for Sustainable Insurance and the Africa Climate Risk Facility that was launched at COP27, and we'll get those updates. And once again, we will have updates from or for the Africa Climate Action Summit and how to get involved. Thank you again for joining us, and our next meeting will not be in July. It will be on the 9th of August as we prepare for, it will be about a month to the Africa Climate Action Summit. Thank you once again for joining us, and see you again soon. Happy Eid to those that do celebrate. Thanks and bye.